see here, we're going to go to the Max Schmidheiny Lecture, 70 years after the end of World War II. That's one of the reasons I had a chance to bring that up with Bertrand there about modernizing institutions 70 years after World War II, which we marked this month. The special lecture for the 2015 St. Gallen Symposium this year is the same author of Why Nations Fail. If you haven't read the book, you really should. It's a phenomenal insight to what works and what doesn't work in governments, how the West needs to modernize and have the structures that can sustain downturns and also see the emerging markets rising, but can they sustain growth? And that's the challenge today without the correct institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can get you to quit talking, please. Excuse me. Thanks. Sorry. So we want to mark this 70th anniversary and this lecture by giving a warm welcome to Professor Daron Acemoğlu of MIT, again, the author of Why Nations Fail. Please.
Wonderful. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think it's not often that you find a room full of leaders of tomorrow and leaders of today. So it's with great responsibility that I'm taking this task of speaking to you today. And about 70 years ago, 1946, 69 years ago, Winston Churchill gave a speech at the University of Zurich. I think he just couldn't get invitation to St. Gallen, so he had to go to the University of Zurich. And with the free ice cream, I can see why he really wanted to come to St. Gallen. But at Zurich, he said, "I wish to speak to you today about the tragedy of Europe." And he went on, "Over wide areas of a vast, quivering mass of tormented, hungry, careworn, and bewildered human beings gape at the ruins of their cities and their homes and scan the dark horizons for the approach of some new peril, tyranny, or terror." And then he went on and he said, the solution is we must build a kind of United States of Europe, though he also added that Britain would not be part of it. So 70 years from then on, we do have a sort of a United States of Europe. But what have we achieved? Is that a success? Is that a failure? I am not a scholar of European studies, so I'm not going to tell you about the inner workings of the European Union or its detailed balance sheet in terms of success or failure. Instead, what I want to do is first introduce a framework for what I believe is a good way of thinking about success and failure, and then use that framework in the context of the problem as Winston Churchill posed it and as we are living it now. The framework is the one that I have developed over many years of collaboration with James Robinson and summarized in Why Nations Fail. The problem with which we start is that of understanding why some societies are able to achieve wealth and comfortable living for their citizens, while others aren't. In this connected, globalized, unified world in which we live, still the gaps between the rich and poor are enormous. The poorest countries in the world are at about 1/40th in terms of the income per capita of Switzerland or the United States. What are the causes of this? With such a huge problem, it should be no surprise that many leading thinkers have come up with potential reasons. Some have emphasized geographic factors. Some have emphasized cultural factors. Many, including in my profession of economics, have emphasized enlightened leadership, where the good, far-sighted leaders make the right choices and lead to prosperity. Others do not. Well, the reason why economists like the enlightened leadership is really not the leaders, but it's their advisors who are enlightened, and we think we are those advisors. And all these factors, of course, play some role in some things, but the starting point of our study is that they're really not capturing what's much more important. which are institutions and incentives. And a lot of what you want to understand about economic success, but also social and political success, are related to these institutional and incentive-related factors. In fact, where we start is quite simple. If you've ever taken an introductory economics course, you will have been introduced to a hypothetical world in which markets function, there are secure property rights, you can write contracts, you can choose whichever occupation you want, and if ever your professor went to the details, he would have also presumed that you can get education, there are the basic services that are going to enable you to take part in the market activities and so on and so forth. These institutions I'm going to call inclusive economic institutions. And inclusive economic institutions, these arrangements, both formal and informal, that support the productive incentives for investment innovation, that encourage people to enter into the occupations in which their productivity is going to be high, create a level playing field on which people can build. They are the best guarantor of long-run economic growth. But the catch is that these inclusive institutions inhabit economics textbooks, but they're not that common in the world. Throughout history, and even today, many countries are ruled by something that looks very different. And of course, reality is in the gray areas, but let me simplify, and let me call the polar opposite extractive economic institutions. And extractive economic institutions provide neither incentives nor opportunities to people. Security of property rights is nil. Courts do not act in an unbiased way, but look after the interests of some connected people. Monopoly is abundant, but even more deeply, individuals are forced, coerced, not given opportunities, and function on a decidedly tilted playing field. And these extractive economic institutions, we've tried to show empirically, and we argue in Why Nations Fail, are not as conducive to economic growth, not as conducive to a comfortable, fulfilling life for the citizens of countries, even though they benefit some parts of the society, particularly those who are able to be at the tilted part of the playing field, those who are able to grab other people's assets, those who are able to get the cushy deals in terms of monopolies and so on and so forth. But more importantly for my purpose today, these economic institutions do not exist in a vacuum. They are supported by certain political arrangements. And to illustrate what I mean by that, perhaps is good to consider an example, and let me take an example of an extreme extractive economic institutions, which will also help me illustrate what I mean by this, which is coerced labor. In fact, slavery. Throughout history, the common form of labor was not people like in the Western world today, where you go and choose your occupation, but was a form of coercion, in extreme form, slavery. For example, in 17th century Barbados, which was actually a very prosperous island because of its sugar production, 80% of the population were slaves. Though Barbados was prosperous, most of these slaves were below or at subsistence level and worked under extremely harsh conditions and unsanitary conditions, as witnessed by the fact that many of them died before the age of 30. So how did an extractive economic institution like slavery, which provided no security of property rights, no level playing field, not even the ability of individuals to choose their occupation, was based on coercion and force, how did a system like that survive? Well, you will not be surprised that it wasn't because of the consent of the slaves. In fact, slaves were not quite happy with this arrangement, as you can see from the fact that the most common thing in slave societies is slave revolts. Most of the time they try to run away, they try to revolt against the oppression they were under. So for that reason, if you're going to maintain a slave society, I'm not recommending it, but the first thing you have to do is you have to get the military. You have to have a strong coercive arms. So you also have to have the legal framework for supporting that slavery, and you have to have the right distribution of political power. And that political power needs to exclude the slaves because they're not going to be supportive. So the way that Barbados functioned, for example, was that all of the military power, judicial power, and political power was concentrated in the hands of a small group of plantation owners, the ones that benefited most from this plantation slavery system. And they were able to use this political system to maintain the extractive economic institutions. So, since I'm not very creative with names, let me call these political institutions extractive political institutions so that it's easy to remember. And these extractive political institutions are going to support and be supported by extractive economic institutions. So there are positive feedbacks or synergies between these two. What is the other extreme? Well, the other extreme, now again going to the ideal type of the polar opposite, would be one where political power is not so centralized, is not so concentrated, is not so unrestrained. And that I'm going to call inclusive political institutions. So inclusive political institutions, as opposed to extractive political institutions, distribute political power widely in society, so different voices, different ideologies, interests, approaches can be represented. They have voice and potentially power, but also puts constraints on the exercise of that power. Now, that's one leg of what we call inclusive political institutions. The second leg, which I'm going to come back to in a second, is what we call state centralization. If you take a society like modern-day Somalia, it's not a society that looks very much like Barbados, where you have a clearly well-defined elite which, through military power and control of the judicial system, can enforce whatever it wants. In fact, it's a society with very diffuse political power. Political power does not lie with governments or mayors or anything like that. Often it lies with clan families. You know, it's a very sort of tribal structure that has survived. And of course, Somalia is not a paragon of stability, economic incentives, opportunities, and so on and so forth, because these very diffuse political power without any degree of centralization doesn't work very well. In fact, even if you have a very small dispute where, you know, you run over somebody from the other clan family, that can easily trigger a huge blood feud, because there aren't good ways of adjudicating disputes, because there isn't a central authority with the ability to do so. So, therefore, the two legs of political institutions that are inclusive is going to be this dispersed distribution of political power and some degree of authority of state, so that order and other things that the state provides, which I'm going to come back to, are going to be possible to provide. Now, to sort of go forward at this point, I need to convince you that this framework has legs, that it actually captures something of value, so that I have the authority from you to go and apply it to the European context. Well, I can tell you it's super strongly supported by empirical evidence, but that won't really convince you because you haven't seen it. But what I can tell you is that I can tell you an illustrative example which at least makes it plausible and also enables me to give a little bit more of a detail about what I mean by these and what are the political dynamics that underpin this sort of inclusive economic institutions and, on the other hand, extractive economic institutions. And while I'm going to come back to Europe, let's start a little bit farther away from home, and let's think about the creation of institutions in the New World, which is a good sort of lab for thinking about these things, because a lot of the action in the New World has taken place, you know, over the last 500 years or so. So it gives us a fairly recent example of both economic and social divergence, and perhaps, if you are so inclined, to see the institutional roots of it. So let's think about one of the conquistadors that started the colonization of the South America, one of the very early ones, actually before Pizarro or Cortez, a name by the name of Juan Díaz de Solís. He started in 1516 the colonization of the southern cone of the South America, what is, you know, today Argentina. So Juan Díaz de Solís is not in many history books for a very good reason. As opposed to people like Cortez and Pizarro, he was not super successful. He went there with the same aspirations and the same strategy as Cortez and Pizarro. In fact, he took two kinds of people with him: soldiers, because he was going to suppress any sort of local resistance and set up something that you would recognize as an extractive regime based on force to get stuff from South America for his king and for himself and his men. What was he going to get? Well, in the best scenario, he was going to get gold or silver. So for that reason, the second type of people that he took with him were goldsmiths. But things did not work out. In the area that he colonized, there weren't the sort of the very rich civilizations that he was expecting. In fact, he was encountered by bands of hunter-gatherer, very sparsely settled, very mobile, without hierarchy, native people, the Charuas and the Kerandi. And that this was not something that worked out very well. Immediately, the Spaniards tried to capture these people, and the Charuas and the Kerandi fought back, and it was a band of Charuas that clubbed de Solis to death 1 year after his arrival, one other reason why he's not so famous in the history books. But no matter, the Spaniards persisted, and they tried to capture the Charuas, who ran away. When they were finally captured, they tried to get them to work, but they wouldn't work. They were not used to agricultural work. They were not used to hierarchical work, so it was a bit of a conundrum for the Spanish. Now, it turns out that the area they colonized was hugely productive. This was the Pampas, the areas around Buenos Aires, which would later become the basis of the Argentine boom, agricultural boom in Argentina in the 19th century, early 20th century. But the Spaniards were totally unprepared to grow their own food, so they started starving, and they sort of went in this direction, that direction, and finally they threw in the towel and they left the entire area. But as they were leaving, another band of these conquistadors, led by a name called Juan de Ayola, went up the Parana River that goes up to Paraguay, and there he encountered another band of Indians, the Guarani. The Guarani are not the Aztec or the Inca, but they were already settled. They had higher population density, they had a hierarchy, they had their kings and princes and princesses, and this was the sort of proposition that the Spaniards could handle. They immediately overpowered them with their military power. They set up their own hierarchy. They married the princesses, and they took over the Guarani institutions and transformed them for their benefits. So just like with the Aztec and the Inca, you see their forced labor institutions like the encomienda, repartimiento, not slavery, but close cousins of it. And through this, they were able to channel a lot of resources, but very importantly, they also paved the way the future economic and the political institutional development of this part of the world, Paraguay, Mexico, Peru, Bolivia included. This process of how these institutions persist is what we spend a lot of time in the book, but I'm not going to talk about it today. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk about how the North American colonization went on. Well, North American colonization did not really get started until about 100 years later, and a crucial event was the Virginia Company, chartered in London as a profit-making enterprise. People invested their money, and the Virginia Company sent 3 ships to Jamestown Colony in Virginia in order to repeat the Spanish success. And they followed very much the Spanish model. They sent 3 ships full of 2 types of people, soldiers and goldsmiths. They were going to capture the people and take gold, silver, perhaps agricultural produce, just like the Spanish were doing very well during that time. But just like de Solis, they did not find a huge civilization they could easily overpower and take over the hierarchy. And they repeated exactly the things that went on with de Solis' expedition. Starving time, inability to capture and use the Indians, but very differently from the Spanish, they did not have the option of going to the Guarani, going to the Aztecs, going to the Incas. So they have to come up with a second strategy, lest the entire profit-making enterprise of the Virginia Company was going to be a huge failure. Well, they came up with the following idea. Well, we cannot capture the native people and put them to work for our benefit, so perhaps we can take all of these poor people who are in destitute situation in Europe, bring them here as indentured servants, and in return, they will have to do the menial work. They would have to do the production, the agricultural production, digging stuff, and then we'll benefit from it. Both the Virginia Company and the governors of the captains of the Jamestown colony would actually benefit. Well, this is what they tried. The colony that they set up with the Europeans in it was certainly no consensual, happy, shiny place. Just to give you a sense of that, let me read from the laws that Sir Thomas Gates, the governor of the Jamestown colony, and his deputy Sir Thomas Dale passed. No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anybody who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or steals ears of corn shall be punished with death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his own private use upon pain of death. So when you read this, you first of all see that it was a pretty draconian place, but there was a reason for this draconian attitude. It wasn't just wanton violence, although that might have existed too. They were really worried about something. They had very valuable resource there, labor. That's the one that they had brought all the way from across the Atlantic, and they wanted to protect it. And protecting it means that don't let it run away, don't let it go by yourself and use that open frontier and that land, and certainly don't let it to produce whatever you want and trade it with other people, because then you're not working on my land. Well, that didn't work either. It didn't work because whatever you threatened these people, they could run away. This was, the Jamestown colony was no North Korea, with a strong state that was able to control things. People just run away. They ran to the Indians. They just went there by their own way. So 11 years after the founding of Jamestown colony, the Virginia Company finally threw in the towel and said, fine, we're not going to profit from this. So we just wash our hands. How did they wash their hands? Well, actually, they did something amazingly innovative. They introduced private property for the first time. They introduced the head right system, which said every settler, every one of these indentured servants, now can get a piece of land, and they can grow whatever they want on that piece of land. And they can sell it to whoever they want. That's their private property. There was no private property, certainly not in the English colonies, and certainly not in the Spanish colonies before then. Now, that's amazing in one sense, but it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't sufficient for the very simple reason that, well, there is Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale a year ago telling you that you're going to be hanged because you're trading an ear of corn with a sailor. And now they're telling you, well, you have secure property rights, you can do whatever you want, we are at your service. You'll be excused for not being fully credulous. You had a situation in which economic institutions were becoming more inclusive, but political power was in the hands of the same people and remained extractive. So 1 year later came the second revolution. A General Assembly was introduced, so the Virginia Company said, fine, we're giving the political power to. And again, through processes that I'm not going to, thank you. Water, great. As important as an ear of corn. Through a process that I'm not going to describe, those institutions also laid the foundation of the subsequent development of the North American colonies. But the reason why I went through this story is threefold. First of all, you can see in this story very clearly that the divergence in the institutions, and you have to take it on faith here that this divergence in institutions was the critical factor for the divergence of the economic outcomes of the North and South, had nothing to do with geography, culture, or enlightened leadership. Geography, both of these places actually turned out to be very productive. It's just that, the political system that you were trying to develop could not stick in one place because you just did not have the populations to enslave and put to work. Culture. Well, the culture is, of course, different. The Greek culture is different from the German culture, and the Spanish culture was different from the English culture. They prayed a different God. They had different customs. Their relationship with their kings, queens were different. But at the end of the day, the similarities are what's striking. Those cultures may have been different, but they tried exactly the same things. And when they hit barriers, they tried to go around them in exactly the same way. But the conditions on the ground were different. And the conditions on the ground enabled the Spanish to actually achieve a large part of their objectives, whereas the English couldn't, and that's why at the end they had to concede the head right system and they had to concede the General Assembly. And that brings me to enlightened leadership. Well, was that English having enlightened leadership? Hell no. In fact, Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale were failed leaders. It wasn't that they had some enlightenment. They wanted to do something, and they failed. Whereas Pizarro and Cortez and the Ayala, those guys succeeded. So they were the good leaders, not Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale. And that brings me to the point that enlightened leadership is only as good as the objectives of the leader. How do you give the objectives the right objectives to these leaders? And then the third point, the third lesson from this story is what I have already emphasized, is that it's not just about economics, it's not just about politics, it's about the two together. The political institutions and the economic institutions needed to work together. Just one of them was an empty promise, and the political institutions by themselves, unless it somehow started changing the incentives on the ground, would not have had the same impact. Now, one thing that's not clear in this story is that though the origins of these things is sort of emphasized, how they evolve is actually quite complex. This is again the institutional persistence story, but it's much more than that. Institutions persist in a very complex way, in a path-dependent way, and they don't always stay the same. They change, and the reason why we have more inclusive institutions in many parts of the world, ranging from Britain to Germany to South Korea to Japan, is that there has been a process of institutional change. Painful, slow, sometimes backfiring, but extractive political institutions have turned in a more inclusive direction. As the story of the settlers' resistance to Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale illustrates, that rarely happens because the leaders who are sitting atop extractive political institutions, who have all this power, suddenly say, oh, well, I want to give my power away for the good of you. It often happens because they are forced to do so. They are forced to do so through institutional channels, if those exist, but in many cases they are forced to do so through protests and demands and fears of people exiting the country. But it's also not a unidirectional change. It's not just that extractive political and economic institutions turn inclusive from time to time. The other is very important, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, which is that inclusive political institutions are also continuously challenged. Why? Well, if there is a dispersed distribution of political rights, then I am just like you. But imagine if I could edge my political power up a little bit. Wouldn't that be great? Well, I could use that political power to get more political power. Perhaps I can get that to subvert things a little bit to my benefit. So, yeah, people in this room, we're all honorable people. We wouldn't do it, but there are others who might do things like that. So there are continuous challenges to the longevity of inclusive political institutions and inclusive economic institutions, and history is full of nascent inclusive political institutions being nipped at the bud or even developing for a while and then collapsing. So I'll come back to that also. And then the final thing I want to talk about the framework, and then I'll turn to Europe, is about states and state capacity and state centralization. So if you remember, I emphasized that you need two legs for inclusive political institutions. This broad distribution of political power, but also the process of state centralization. Actually, if you look at the US history, they went both hand in hand. Once there were the General Assemblies started enabling the local governments to do more things that the citizens wanted: local education, local road building. And the national government, especially after the 1788 Constitution ratification, started doing more. But throughout this process, this state centralization could proceed because the other leg of inclusive political institutions was there. State centralization did not become a behemoth that dominated everything. It was going hand in hand. And again, let me give you a historical example, I promised the last one, to illustrate this. You know, one crucial event we emphasize in Why Nations Fail, and other historians have emphasized also in the creation of inclusive political and economic institutions in England, was the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That came out of a revolution. It was not a peaceful affair. And the revolution was triggered by decades of conflict between the Tudor monarchs, Charles II, before him his beheaded father, Charles I, but particularly Charles II, and then his brother who came to the throne later, James II. The Stuart monarchs were not popular with Parliament, which was a very elite affair still, but was a broader set of especially commercial and gentry interests, because they had a constant project of trying to centralize political power, get more economic power, increase the budget, increase their judicial power, increase their ability to borrow. And the Parliament resisted and resisted. A tug of war finally led to the revolution. Revolution ended up with James II being kicked out, William of Orange, a constitutional monarchy came. Parliament was empowered, and a whole sort of formal and informal arrangements were made so that the next monarchs would be much more constrained. Now, with a story like this, you might expect that what would happen after 1688 is you would have a smaller government. After all, didn't you kick out James II because he wanted to amass more power, economic and political? Well, exactly the opposite happens. Just before 1688, as the historian John Brewer documents, England had actually revenues in GDP less than France. In the next decade or so, it increases to more than twice that of France. It's a huge explosion. So what's going on? Didn't you do this just to prevent the state becoming a huge leviathan? Well, the thing is that once you knew you could control the state, you could enable the state to have greater capacity. So the key here is that state capacity, especially effective state capacity building, does have a very central political element. And that political element is that we would like to have the state with the capacity to do lots of things, provide education, provide healthcare, provide a safety net, provide the right sort of regulation, all of these things. But in many societies, you can't do that because you can't trust the state. It is the institutional and other mechanisms for controlling the state, such as an active media, active civil society, active participation of people, if necessary through protest, that will ensure that you can control the state. And if you know that you can control the state, well, you can have the government control even 45% of GDP, as it does in Scandinavian countries, and people don't complain that this is a government that's capturing this money and eating it up for himself. But then you go to African countries where the government's budget is sometimes as little as 10% of GDP, but nobody wants to give one more penny to the government because all of that money goes into the things that they don't want. So therefore, state capacity, state building, you need to look at it from the same light of the conflict between different groups in society and the methods, institutional and other methods of controlling the government. Now we come to Europe. So how is this useful for Europe? Well, let me start where Winston Churchill started. At the end of the World War II, when Churchill was giving his speech at Zurich, Europe was indeed in a destitute state. Much of the infrastructure was destroyed. Over 100 million people were killed by war or other war-related means in the 30 years preceding. 10% of German population was killed. Almost all of the infrastructure of the major cities of Germany, Berlin, Düsseldorf, Dresden, and others, were destroyed. Same thing, Belgium, Netherlands, France. Britain, where perhaps the damage was less, was still in a pitiful state. In terms of technology, these places were fully backward because they had not been doing anything other than war making. Britain, half of the households in Britain did not have access to indoor plumbing, to sewage, to hot water. Only 5,000 TV sets in Britain at this time. And more importantly, as Winston Churchill hinted at, the fear of tyranny. The smart money in 1945 would have been on the Third World War or some version of it starting. But nothing of the sort happened. Instead, you had a very peaceful 70 years, but also a huge economic success. The 30 years between 1945 and the first oil crisis of 1974 were the fastest growing period for the European economies. Even after the oil crisis, the next 30 years had their bumps, but were very, very rapid growth. How was this achieved? I think it was achieved by two huge European successes. One was that Europe, starting in 1945, worked hard, with some compromises, to build national institutions that were much more inclusive. Gone were the era of the Weimar Republic, where you had elections, but the elites in the background tried to undermine old fabric of these electoral institutions. Instead, quite the opposite. A lot of compromises were made so that inclusivity in the political system could be brought up. And national politics becoming more inclusive though it did have some compromises in terms of economic arrangements that especially were important to check inequality because that was thought to lead to a lot of tensions, was also generally going in a more inclusive direction. This inclusivity included both trade on relatively competitive terms being encouraged, incentives for businesses, innovation, investment, and also the much more directed efforts of the state with its newfound state capacity and newfound authority to use that state capacity, because now the institutions were supporting the use of that and the control of the state in a direction which provided safety nets, which provided education, which provided healthcare, which provided the level playing field for people to take part in that economic activity. So this national institutions going in an inclusive direction was central. But there was only one leg. National institutions were restrained in a place like Europe by what was going on in the international sphere. And the international sphere, if it led to another war between Germany and France, no democratic institutions could survive or take root. So the second element was a development of supranational institutions, the European Union. So Winston Churchill was not alone in calling for a United States of Europe, and many leaders at the time, just like Winston Churchill, thought that that was most important for political reasons, for ensuring peace. So European Union was a political project and a very successful one, because not only has there not been a war in Europe, very unusual if you look at it from the point of view of history, but there has not even been a single coup or a coup attempt. You know, Portugal and you know, Spain and these countries being left after the European Union and joining only thereafter. So, European Union tried to achieve this, but it tried to achieve this as a political project, understanding some priorities, but also making a lot of compromises. As I mentioned, there were compromising in the national economy as well, building up of some rigidities because that was politically imperative. But the problem that European Union was trying to solve was, I think, much harder. So the way that they tried to deal with this was twofold. One was, starting with the Coal and Steel Commission, increase interdependence. It would have been an anachronism for an area as developed as Europe without any natural boundaries to be economically isolated into nation states. But it was because these nation states were warring with each other. So that started changing, and it was the first big imperative of the European Union: increase economic interdependence. That was almost a religion. And many decisions the European Union made, I think, over the subsequent 70 years, or the European leaders make, sorry, European Union did not exist 7 years ago, I think, or at least my impression is, that should be understood as that imperative of increasing interdependence. But the second is that European leaders, and this is sort of the Monnet doctrine, so to speak, thought that this could only be achieved by a top-down, behind-the-closed-doors arrangements, because the people were just too preoccupied, wouldn't see the big picture, and nationalism was still raging. So we should do this as quickly as we can, but behind the closed doors. So what you got was very successful, because you achieved the interdependence and you achieved the peacemaking European institutions. And in addition, I think you achieved something quite remarkable too: building of supranational institutions, which is quite rare. The only other example of successful building of supranational institutions is the United States of America, where the problem was not as challenging and was also facilitated by a war of independence that the 13 states fought together, and much greater integration in many respects. Many other building attempts of supranational institutions in Latin America, for example, have all faltered: the Gran Colombia, the United States of Central America, and all of that. So, but that is an important thing. You know, why did I emphasize state centralization? Well, we emphasized it in the book, but I could have left it out of this. But I wanted to emphasize this aspect of state capacity, the education, social safety net. But I also wanted to emphasize that the state's level of activity has to be where the economic activity is. The Articles of Confederation, which the United States ratified first in 1781, was not a good framework, and that's why in less than 8 years it was changed by the US Constitution. Because when the economic activities were across states, political power was only at the level of the state. That's a bit like the Somali clans. Somali clans don't work very well. They would have worked great if all economic activities were within Somali clans because they have their own authority. They don't work well because most people now in Somalia interact as much with people who are not in their clan as who are in their clan. So that's the need for supranational institutions. So that's part of the success that European Union managed at. But then there is the European failure part, which is the mirror image. All of these things, because they were political compromises, came with a variety of problems. And the most important problem is that exactly what I've tried to emphasize with my discussion of state capacity. So the English Parliament, it's very confusing. It's England first and becomes Britain, whatever. The English Parliament in 1688 did not want state capacity because it couldn't control it. It wanted state capacity after 1688 because it could control it. Well, in Europe, European leaders, through the Monnet Doctrine, created a state capacity at the supranational level, but without worrying about its control. So you've created a huge machine, a huge edifice, but without any ability for the citizens to control. So there is very little accountability system because politics remains purely national. National governments will have an indirect control over the bureaucracy, but that's a very delegated way of doing the control. So that's where one fault line starts. That fault line becomes, I think, more problematic because the imperative to increase economic interdependence also went very fast. Did it need to go that fast? Could it have gone slower? I don't know the answer to that. I think the imperative early on was to go fast so that you created peace, you created harmony. Later on, perhaps it was just more of the same because there was nobody to tell these people to stop because all of the deals were being made in closed doors. So you have this economic interdependence, but without really the design aspects that would have fit. So when the Articles of Confederation turned into the US Constitution, there was a whole series of changes. Authority was shifted to the federal state. The federal state now had the power to tax and the tax revenue to support the debts that it took over. The military power, political centralization. No longer the state government was the seat of power, the federal government. We don't remember who the Massachusetts or the Rhode Island governor is. We remember George Washington. Well, in Europe, all of these things did not happen, but interdependence increased because European Union expanded and expanded, and it created more and more economic links through monetary policy, through regulation, but with limited fiscal centralization and certainly very little political centralization. And this created, I think, what you would expect from the framework that I am suggesting. If you give people power and you don't make them accountable, you don't have the institutional and the popular ways of controlling that power is going to get misused. But worse, I think that level of lack of control at the top then started trickling down, lower down. It's not a uniform thing, but I think that the rapid process of European centralization also brought together much tougher political challenges than perhaps needed to be the case. So, in particular, countries that were being brought into the fold, such as Greece, but to some degree also Portugal, Spain, were institutionally very different. They had not developed the institutional checks, the party system, etc., but they were brought in full speed into the political system with a lot of resources that they now had access to and implicit guarantees that their debt was secure so that they could borrow. So what happened now, that all of the constraints on the politicians, who were not very accountable to start with, now were lifted. So once you lift those constraints on these politicians who know how to game the system, who know how to use the money in order to form their clientelistic networks, well, all hell breaks loose. So that was the far part of the European failure. What's the balance sheet? I think it's hard to say, but I would go on the success side. Sure, we've created a lot of failures, and some of it was avoidable. But in hindsight, the 30 years of the most rapid growth, 30 years of another growth, peace, national institutions that have become very strong, I think is a success that any continent, any country, any community should aspire to. But the problems are quite real because they have been brought to the fore by the financial crisis. They have not been caused by the financial crisis. There is a view which I find very frustrating, which is that this is just a pure macroeconomic problems, and then if you create aggregate demand, you're going to solve this problem. I think this is so incorrect and so misleading because the problem is a structural one, the problem is a political one, and it needs to have a political solution. And I don't have that solution, but I think there are some elements of it that are easy to see, and some elements of it which we can speculate about. The element that is easy to see is that democracy, accountability needs to be strengthened. And that needs to be both at the national level, which has weakened in some parts, and at the supranational level, because I think pulling back from the supranational centralization is not an option, and it's not a good option. So how do you do that? How do you create accountability for a giant like this? I think one needs to come up with different ways of thinking about the problem. For instance, we are in Switzerland. What better than thinking of ways of making local democracy with national democracy work? I think it's practically impossible to imagine that Europe is going to have a national, European level government which is going to be accountable to people in Lithuania and Portugal and Athens. So I think what you need to have is a method in which a lot of services are delivered at the local level where accountability is, but then they are built up in some fashion back to the national and back to the supranational level. So this is more or less what Swiss Confederation or the American states try to achieve, where, for example, in the United States, governors have a lot of power, but they are subject to the rules and the laws of the federal government. Mayors have a huge amount of power, but they are subject to the state laws as well as the national laws. To make that, it's not an easy thing, but it can be made, or it can be tried. But the reason why I think we need to try these things is that I think what European Union tried to achieve was very important, and turning back would both be very costly. And I think creating supranational institutions is something that will be more and more needed, because in the same way that it was economic activities were between states and between European states, they're going to be more and more between countries, and then we do need supranational institutions. We pull back from them, it's not going to be successful. Now, I think there is something that makes me optimistic. And what makes me optimistic is that during that 60 years of rapid institutional and economic development, Europe achieved something, or European countries or European peoples have achieved something quite rare in history. A political system which is on the whole quite responsive and representative, accountable, and a civil society that's very active with a free media, engaged citizenship. Yeah, sure, people sometimes don't turn to the polls, but on the whole, the notions of controlling the state, the notions of providing public goods, the safety net, education, opportunity, general inclusivity, I think are fairly ingrained now in the political culture of Europe and the political practice of Europe. And it is those things that you can build on. And I think the biggest danger would be the view that Europe needs to take a huge 180-degree turn and perhaps emulate China, where you can suspend democracy and you can try to engineer economic success through some souped-up version of the Monnet Doctrine, some European Commission that's not representative but has the iron fist to do whatever you want. And I think that's exactly the wrong way, because I think European success has come from not that part, but from the more inclusive part of it. And I think the appearance of success of non-democratic or partly extractive regimes, I think, is illusory, because they have achieved success during the easy phase, where economic growth can come through investment, through importing technology. But for the innovation, which is the future of Europe and already the competitive advantage of Europe, you do need a very different economic system. And that economic system has the basis for the political system of Europe. And I think that is not something to be abandoned. That's not something to be belittled. I think on the whole, the balance sheet is that European success outweighs the European failure, but the European failures are very important and we have to deal with them. Thank you very much. I will take some questions, but I want to tell you one thing first, which I've been instructed to do. During my questions, do not certainly leave the room. But after the question and answer, I was kidding, you can leave. But after my questions, please do not, because the student committee, 2 members of the student committee will come and say a few words for closing remarks. So please wait for them to come. But in the meantime, I can take a few questions. Yes, please.
Thanks, Professor Acemoğlu, for a very excellent lecture. And I want to pursue further the point of political centralization and state capacity. And I certainly agree with the point, and I think it's very important, because on the plus side, you have political centralization system like China, but since with its fairly functional accountability system, has led to some very impressive growth. But on the downside, you have countries in Latin America, for example, Argentina, where introduced the decentralization, but regional competition is just too fierce that leads to instability. But my confusion is just that I didn't see how these arguments fits with the previous, your previous definition of the inclusive political institution, which by definition is like dispersed and spreaded political power. So is it that the inclusive political institution and oversimplification, or how do you reconcile these 2 different points? Thank you.
Excellent question. I think thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, because I was extremely quick on that, and that's indeed potentially confusing. So I think the point that I'm defining inclusive political institutions, and I think at some level is the right definition, is that political power is dispersed, but the means for that power to be exercised at a level that has access to the entire territory that it contains are there. So contrast the following 3 models. One is it's hugely decentralized, such that there is no body to sort out any dispute between one locality and another, or regulate the trade, or provide public goods in a way that sort of cuts across these boundaries, such as universities or research support, or even keep law and order. That would be a failure of the state centralization. Take another model like the North Korea, where the state, despite all of its inefficiencies and has some capacity to actually check everything, or not everything, but control things within much of North Korea. There is this centralization, but there isn't the sort of the accountability that it checks on the dispersed political power. So the model I'm describing is one in which the state apparatus is there, like, for example, in many European countries, where the national federal government is there. It has its police force, it has its judiciary, it has its politicians at the national stage. They can do things. It's not like in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa where they can rule the capital, they cannot go to the periphery. But the political power, political voice is dispersed, and when that centralized power is used in a way that it doesn't get the approval of a sufficient number of people within society, they can be kicked out of office. Or other branches of the government, such as legislature or the judiciary, can stop them. Or the media can shed light on what they're doing so that there are popular protests for stopping them. So that's the accountability part. That's the dispersed distribution of political power, but that political power is then delegated up top to people who have the capacity to use it over the territory of the country. Yes, please?
Thank you, Professor Acemoğlu, for that fascinating lecture, and I, like many people, are in stark admiration of you. My name is Akash, and I study economics. And if you would allow me a little bit more of a digressing question. About 2 decades or so ago, economics sort of had a marriage with mathematics in an effort to become a lot more scientific. And this turned into very mainstream economic schools of thought. And many people have argued that this has been one of the perhaps causes of the crisis which we experienced recently. And this while schools of thought such as Kahneman have still been in the fringes. So I would like to ask you, do you see economics becoming more inclusive in the future and returning to its political, theoretical backgrounds, if you will? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. My take on that is more nuanced. I think mathematics, use of quantitative methods in economics is here to stay, and for good reason. You know, today I've talked to you at a very broad level, but I made a lot of empirical claims. And I can try to illustrate these empirical claims with historical examples, but I can't make a good case that these empirical examples are representative or they capture what's going on in a true manner. Even if I could show some correlations, I would not be able to show you the causation. In order to tell about really that institutions cause things or state capacities has a causal effect, you need to both use empirical data but also mathematical methods for the modeling of it. So I think mathematics is here to stay, and I think for good reason. Otherwise, we would have no way of adjudicating the disputes and the very different perspectives within social science in general. But you're right that certain parts, you know, this is a very imperfect process. The empirical sort of ascendancy of methods in economics is still in its infancy at some level. So there are still parts of economics that sort of are more into a debate form. And I think it is, you know, a case can be made that perhaps, you know, theories such as the efficient market hypothesis, which says, well, if there are certain innovations, they must be for the good, have played a role in the financial crisis. And I'm not going to deny the possibility of that. But I think more important than that is how those theories, which are often very clearly articulated as simplifications, have been used by politicians and regulators who are either beholden to their ideological ends, or often because that was politically or for other reasons and related to lobbying and pressure on them, actually expedient for them to do so. So I think that is actually much more important than whether mathematics and quantitative methods and how much role they play. And I think that is the part that we need to have more inclusivity, that these ideas need to be more married with other perspectives. I think one problem there, and I think, you know, this is going, you know, it's a long answer, but I think it's an important issue. I think one problem is one of communication. And the communication issue is that if you talk to a majority of economists, they would not believe that the world is an efficient market hypothesis or the competition is so seamless that you don't need any regulation. But oftentimes, for certain problems, you would write down models or approaches that abstract from certain things. And that gets then misused in regulatory debates by politicians, etc. And I think that's another part of an important thing that needs to be fixed. But more importantly, coming back to your greater inclusivity issue, I think without abandoning the quantitative edge of economics, I think there is great need for making it more inclusive in terms of questions. You know, 15 years ago, you know, topics that I have talked about today, such as institutional development, long-run economic development, political, economic interactions, culture, and so on and such things would not have been on the economic agenda. And I think today they are, and that shows that there is some degree of inclusivity, but there are many other questions and many other perspectives, including those such as Danny Kahneman's behavioral ones that I think should be brought in. And I think, you know, the fact that Kahneman's work was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics say that it's not entirely ignored, but of course there will be new syntheses over time. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Martin from Berlin. I'm a writer. I think a lot also about Europe. You mentioned that maybe putting more power on the local level might be an interesting option. As you are an historian, can you think about a time in history where this re-decentralization, so putting more power on the local level, actually worked?
Well, that's a good question, and unfortunately, I'm not a good enough historian to know the answer to it. But It certainly does work in the US. I mean, the US system is not a perfect one, it has a lot of problems. But US and Switzerland, both of them have managed to have local power and local delivery of public services. And in the US, you know, I think the big failure is not at the municipality level or the mayoral level. At some point there was machine politics and huge corruption at the beginning of the 20th century, and there it was actually important for the federal government to step in and regulate some of these practices. But the two have actually sometimes worked very well. The UK is sort of considering it. I think that it actually badly needs it, but whether it will actually implement it or not, I think if the UK were able to go in that direction, you know, perhaps it would be successful. But I don't have great examples of this being introduced as a reform and working seamlessly. Yes, please.
Thanks, Sam Johnson from New Zealand. I just wondered if you could comment on the more the least developed states, and particularly in reference to Nepal and the likes of the disaster there last week, and the government openly admitting actually it can't respond to the disaster of more than really 25% of the country. And you know, this is a perfect opportunity to completely reform its governance structures and decentralize. And what's the more practical way that a government and the ministers could actually go about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, but you know, I think it's a very difficult one also because, you know, we've had other examples like this, Haiti, the earthquake, but you know, Haiti and Nepal share many problems together. When you start from a situation of very weak states, very divided society, you know, it's not that easy to reform it overnight. I think exactly like the process that I was suggesting after the Glorious Revolution, you need the state capacity building to go hand in hand with the voice of the citizens. You know, Nepal until about 15 years ago was still, you know, an extremely hierarchical society with its aristocracy, forced labor, you know, extremely non-representative, and still a lot of its remnants remain. You know, it's not going to be very easy, but of course, I think sometimes such big crises play a transformative role. You know, many non-democratic countries sort of collapse and make way to democracies following some economic crises, the evidence shows. But at least the few cases that I know from a totally devastating natural disaster in a country that has already huge political problems, I think those have not been that easy to deal with. And I think it's like exactly the same sort of problems that we're encountering in Afghanistan or Iraq. You know, you cannot just from the above bring state capacity. But I think the message is not just a pessimistic one here, because I think you can actually see that in many cases, this gradual building of inclusivity at the political level and state capacity together can work. The question is, how do you make it politically feasible? And that's going to depend on the conditions. And there are many people in the room here who are better practitioners on this than I am. This lady there wanted to ask a question, and I think the red is flashing that the session time is over, so I don't know when I should end.
I'll be very quick though. Hi, good evening, I'm Darlene. I'm from the Philippines, but I'm studying in Singapore. I may be misunderstanding your core argument though, but please correct me if I'm wrong. You're arguing that extractive political and economic institutions causes nations to fail, and that inclusive political and economic institutions promote success for nations or economies. But institutions are made of human beings, and human beings are corruptible. They can be vulnerable for mistakes. Is there a guarantee that these bureaucrats, in IR you have bureaucratic politics, is there a guarantee that these human beings would not actually destroy the very essence of that institution?
Great question, and I think thanks for giving me an opportunity to clarify this. So absolutely, I think the whole story here is about the endogeneity of institutions, and institutions are neither immutable, that's why they are endogenous and they evolve, nor are they a rigid framework, but they provide a set of rules for interactions to happen in an ever-changing way. So when I'm talking of inclusive political institutions, I am talking of institutions that introduce such things as the broad distribution of political power, electoral democracy, or separation of power, and media control, or transparency of government. But many of these things have been misused in the past. You know, you have You have many electoral democracies that are hugely corrupt, who are captured, who are clientelistic. You have, media that can be used for misinformation rather than actual information. So in every step, the institutions provide a framework, but they need to be supported. And that goes back to what I was trying to emphasize, but in a very quick way, that, the elites, you can never fully trust them. So if you just form an institution, and of course this room is full of elites, but I don't mean you guys, the bad elites. If you set an institution and just let professional politicians, bureaucrats, and a few businessmen run it, over time it will get worse and worse. So that's why civil society, the mobilization of civil society in active politics, and that's why local politics is so important, because that's one thing that actually draws people, because the issues are so close to them. If you ask people in Lithuania to get engaged with budget negotiations in Brussels, it's not going to be as easy to draw them. But that drawing of people, protests, social media, actual media, people voicing their discontent, I think those are the things that are necessary to keep the institutions from working. So that's why you need the institutionalized structure, but you also need the civil society and the people's participation to make this work. Should I call it a day? Thank you.